Q, South Vietnam, February 1968. An American armored vehicle rolls through a narrow street during the Tet Offensive. Its crew has faced small arms fire for days. They know how to handle that. They do not see the man in the doorway. He is carrying a tube less than a meter long, resting on his shoulder. Inside it, a rocket with a warhead shaped like nothing the crew has trained against. He aims for a fraction of a second. He fires. The vehicle stops. The weapon that cost the Soviet Union less to build than the paint job on the vehicle it disabled. It had entered service 7 years earlier, issued to a Red Army squad in 1961, and nobody at the design bureau that built it could have predicted where it would end up, or how long it would still be in service, or how completely it would outlive the war it was designed for. This is the story of how the Soviet Union built the most successful anti-tank weapon in history for the price of a bicycle. To understand why the RPG-7 exists, you have to understand what came before it, and why that weapon had already stopped working by the time the tanks it was built to fight had changed. In the years after the Second World War, Soviet infantry carried a shoulder-fired weapon called the RPG-2. It fired a fin-stabilized grenade with a shaped charge warhead designed to punch through the armored vehicles of the era. It worked for a while. Then Western tank designers started adding more steel, sloping their armor at better angles, and building vehicles the RPG-2's warhead simply could not defeat anymore. By the mid-1950s, Soviet infantry had a weapon in every squad that was already becoming obsolete against the tanks it was supposed to stop. Development on a replacement began in 1958, led by the State Design Bureau that would later be known as Basalt. The requirement was not complicated to state. Build something an infantryman can carry alone, fire without training for years, and use to disable a tank that costs more than his entire village. What emerged from that requirement did something unusual for Soviet weapons design. It solved the problem almost entirely through the physics of the warhead, not through the size or complexity of the launcher. The launcher itself is close to primitive by design, a steel tube, less than a meter long, open at both ends. No moving parts beyond a simple trigger mechanism. No recoil system in the conventional sense, because the weapon does not need one. The reason it needs no recoil system is the same reason it can be built and issued for almost nothing. If you're finding this interesting, subscribing helps make sure you don't miss what happens next. When the trigger is pulled, a small charge in the base of the rocket launches it clear of the tube at a modest speed, low enough that a soldier standing behind the shooter is not endangered by backblast in the way a true recoilless rifle would require. Once the rocket has cleared the tube by a safe distance, a rocket motor ignites and accelerates the warhead to its full flight speed. The launcher itself never has to contain that acceleration. It only has to survive the initial low-pressure launch. That single design choice is why the tube can be made from thin steel, why it weighs barely 7 kilograms fully assembled, and why it costs so little to manufacture that it could be issued to entire armies rather than rationed among specialists. But a light, cheap tube is worthless if the thing it fires cannot defeat armor. And this is where the weapon's real engineering achievement sits. In a part of the system, most people watching a soldier fire, one will never think about. The warhead does not rely on speed or mass to punch through steel, it relies on geometry. Inside the nose of the rocket is a metal cone, lined with a thin layer of copper, packed behind it with high explosive. When the warhead strikes its target, the explosive detonates from the rear forward, collapsing that copper cone inward on itself in a fraction of a millisecond. The collapsing metal does not act like a bullet anymore. It focuses into an extremely thin, extremely fast jet, traveling at several kilometers per second, moving so quickly that on the timescale of the impact, the steel armor in front of it behaves less like solid metal and more like a fluid. The jet does not smash through the armor. It flows through it, the way a needle passes through water. What is left afterward is a narrow, superheated channel straight through whatever the warhead struck, along with a spray of molten metal fragments on the other side capable of killing everyone inside the vehicle without the outer hull ever being breached by anything larger than a few millimeters. This is why the RPG-7 could defeat armor far heavier than the tube firing it would suggest was possible. The launcher does almost none of the work. The geometry inside the warhead does all of it. The original PG-7 warhead entering service in 1961 could defeat roughly 260 millimeters of rolled steel armor. Later variants, developed through the 1970s and 80s as tank armor improved, pushed that figure considerably higher, some exceeding 500 millimeters, and a tandem charge version introduced in the late 1980s was specifically engineered to defeat the reactive armor blocks that NATO and Warsaw Pact tanks alike had begun bolting onto their hulls in response to weapons exactly like this one. The RPG-7 entered Red Army service in 1961, replacing the RPG-2 at squad level. Within a decade, the Soviet Union had done something with it that changed the character of infantry warfare permanently. They gave it away. Not to allies in the conventional military aid sense of tanks and jets, sold at government-to-government price. The RPG-7 and its ammunition were distributed at a scale and a cost point that put it within reach of guerrilla movements, national liberation armies, and irregular forces that could never have afforded a Soviet tank, a Soviet aircraft, or a Soviet artillery piece. A single unit cost roughly the same as a decent bicycle. A crate of them cost less than the vehicle a single well-aimed shot could destroy. By the late 1960s, the weapon had reached North Vietnamese infantry, where it was carried by nearly every squad in the People's Army of Vietnam. Its combat debut is contested between the Six-Day War of 1967 and the fighting in Vietnam that same year, but its reputation was made unmistakably during the Tet Offensive of 1968 in the close urban fighting around the city of Hue, where American armoured vehicles designed to withstand small arms fire found themselves disabled by soldiers who had appeared in doorways and side streets with a weapon that cost almost nothing and needed almost no training to use effectively at close range. During the Soviet Union's own war in Afghanistan through the 1980s, the weapon appeared again, this time in the hands of the Mujahideen, fighting Soviet armor with the same design the Soviet Union had given to the world 2 decades earlier. Fighters in that conflict learned to engage at extremely close range, often under 80 meters, where the weapon's accuracy limitations mattered least and its armor-piercing performance mattered most. The weapon the Soviet Union built to arm its own infantry against NATO tanks ended up, within a single generation, being fired at Soviet vehicles by the people the Soviet Union had once supplied it to fight. Production has never meaningfully stopped. Manufactured continuously since 1958, more than 9 million units have been built. It is currently in service in some variant, with the armed forces of roughly 40 countries manufactured domestically or under license in at least 9 of them, from the original Russian production line at the Degtyarev plant to Chinese, Iranian, and Bulgarian variants that differ in small details but share the same core physics in the warhead. Modern militaries have spent enormous sums developing composite armor, explosive reactive armor, and active protection systems specifically to counter it. Slat armor, the cage-like steel frames now bolted onto the sides of modern armored vehicles, exists almost entirely because of this one weapon, a defensive technology costing tens of thousands of dollars per vehicle, developed and fitted at scale in direct response to a weapon that costs a few hundred. That asymmetry is the entire story of the RPG-7. A design bureau in the late 1950s was told to solve one problem: give an infantryman a way to fight a tank. What they built solved that problem so completely and so cheaply that 6 decades later, with newer and far more sophisticated anti-armor weapons long since developed and fielded by every major military on Earth, the tube launched. Shape charge weapon issued to a Red Army squad in 1961 is still the single most common way an infantryman anywhere in the world engages an armoured vehicle. The design bureau that built it gave the weapon a name that was almost bureaucratic in its plainness: handheld anti-tank grenade launcher. What they actually built was something closer to a permanent shift in the arithmetic of warfare. A machine costing hundreds of dollars, built by unskilled labour on a Soviet production line, capable of destroying a vehicle costing millions, crewed by men who had spent years training to operate it. The tank had won the argument about armoured warfare for most of the 20th century through sheer cost. Only a wealthy, industrialised state could build one. The RPG-7 was the Soviet Union's answer to that argument, and it is an answer that every army in the world, including the one that built it, has had to live with ever since.